Yeah.
All right, here, go ahead.
Nope.
Okay, so Columbus came on the second voyage. First bloody encounter between Native Americans and a conquistador was here on our soil. 1493 was when he came, and it was actually the Taino people that were some of our first peoples, the Taino and then the Kalinago, which are otherwise known as the Tainos. It was the Tainos, and then it was the Kalinago. The Kalinago are also known as Caribs, but we don't say Caribs because that means cannibal. It was basically Taino woman that was in a canoe with her family, and when the men came in, they came in to try to get like water, but obviously, you know, they were like raping women and stuff. They were not friendly, like how we think that they were.
Yeah.
So she actually shot back with a Manchineel arrow and shot and killed one of his men. Lived to tell her tale. So we kind of mark that as our first really like active resistance. It's kind of in the DNA of resistance. It's really in the people of the Virgin Islands. Second successful revolution that ended slavery was here, right outside these fort walls. In 1848, 8,000 people. Afro-Crucians demanded their freedom. The governor Van Scholten of the time, whose mistress was a woman of color, Anna Hegard. He had already made some small changes like Danish schools so that all the school children were educated and all babies were free, but they would have continued slavery for another 10 years, and the people have had enough.
So it was Columbus who first came here via Spanish, right?
1493 was Spain. We were also under Dutch rule. In fact, there was a Dutch Creole that was really popular, kind of like our dialect, that old language, Dutch Creole. The British, the Knights of Malta, the French burned the island down, the time of the cane culture, in the 1600s, and then in 1733, the Danes had already owned St. Thomas and St. John's. They bought St. Croix. Mind you, 1733 is significant because the island of St. John was taken over by the Kwamo people who were enslaved, from Ghana. But that particular empire, that nation was so powerful and so much nobility, they refused to be enslaved. They had even taken over Fort Christiansford, which is the main port where all the Europeans were working together to basically enslave Africans. And it's strategically. This is, you know, West Africa, this is the Gold Coast.
Yeah.
And you got to think about also too, all of those powerful civilizations. I included a lot of that when you go in that historic exhibit, like the Benin bronzes and Timbuktu, because we really want our local kids, you know, our African, Caribbean young people to know that their ancestors built the wonders of the world, that they fought back. Whenever you teach slavery, we have to teach about the resistance. So that whole exhibit's really been redone to really amplify these histories of resistance.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Do you know why the French burned down?
Yeah, they wanted to climb it. And so we have rainforest here on our island. Our west end, that was actually the only part that didn't burn down, which is like all up this Mahogany Road. If you go up there, it's like almost semi-tropical. The canopy was really destroyed in Hurricane Hugo in '89, but it's kind of like Puerto Rico. You know, it's not quite as rainforest, but close.
Okay.
That land was what the land used to be like.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, that area is more so. But yeah, they wanted to get into, you know, crops. They wanted to have cash crops to send back money back to the motherland.
Oh, gotcha.
You know, this extractive economy. So important to know that after the emancipation in 1838, 30 years later, it was still de facto slavery. So our main revolutionary leader, General Goodhull, or Moses Scott Lee, General Goodhull, they basically had him, after Van Scholten did the Proclamation of Freedom, they said, now go and try to pacify everybody. So he went and he had like groups of people, and they went to try to like calm people down, burning down all the plantations. So nobody was actually killed. It was a pretty, you know, in terms of revolutions, I would say that it was pretty peaceful. The problem with that is you don't have self-determination, and you don't have full autonomy, and you have the Danes still really calling the shots, still really extracting sugar, the sugar economy, extracting money off of, labor. People were paid like pennies, so they couldn't afford to move off the land. They were no longer given their food rations. They were no longer given their clothing. Situation is pretty grim. As you know, we have extreme weather. We always have. We've always had hurricanes and droughts. We're on this fault line with Puerto Rico, one of the deepest trenches of this earthquake. So whenever you have these disasters, you have food shortages. Well, if you're not feeding, your people are going hungry. Also, that was a big reason for marronage, or running off of a plantation. You see a lot of marronage happening in the 1600s in St. John, in St. Thomas, over to the Tortola, the BVIs, and then here, we were, like I told you, the Eastern Taino Alliance. So we really have the connection more towards Puerto Rico, Culebra, and Vieques. So our people were actually jumping ship, our Afro-Crucians, jumping ship in either flagging down ships and then going to Puerto Rico where they would be freed if they converted, or they would be, sometimes they were sold back into slavery though. Kind of like how, like on the border, you have the coyotes, sometimes they're like exploiting a lot of the immigrants. It's similar because you do see, like in the archives, you'll see accounts where they weren't always free. I tell you this history because it's important, again, just to see the roots with Puerto Rico and understand that a lot of Maroons had that indigenous knowledge. Because of this Eastern Taino Alliance, a lot of our Maroons mixed in with the indigenous communities that were left. They learned how to make canoes out of the trees, so a lot of them were also able to build boats. And they went over to Louisa and to Ponce, depending on the weather. You're going to see bomba, which is an African drum rhythm and dance. It was a tool to organize. Our bambula, these are all Africanisms that have survived, that have been reinvented. Cultural legacies of resistance. And again, it's another way to really link Afro-Crucians to Puerto Rico. And then, so I told you about the 1878, the fire. So 7 queens took over, led the charge. They burned down half of Frederickstead. None of the walls were ever breached here, but they were able to get to, they burned down the plantations where they were known for like the most brutal conditions. And, some of the conditions maybe improved a little bit.
And the Danish built this fort.
The Danish built this, yeah, in the 1670s. Interesting to note, the cannons, while some of them are pointed out, they never really fired off on other imperial efforts or other, invasion from European nations. Cannons were also faced outward to basically deter Africans from uprising. So really these forts were in your towns to protect your plantation. So they were pointing out to protect the King's Land in LaGrange, which is this neighborhood right here, north of us. And yeah, 1878, so then really things don't really change like, too much, because you have, like I said, the fire burn. It wasn't until David Hamilton Jackson, who is our MLK, major civil rights leader, educator, statesman, orator, judge. Basically, he went to Denmark in 1915. We were still under Danish rule, and fought to have freedom of the press, and the first free black newspaper called the Herald.
Oh, nice.
And in the Herald, they were able to tell the full story of the brutal, inhumane conditions, really slavery-like conditions of the sugar industry. Because the industrial component was harsh, not just like even the being in the fields and the working, but like feeding the cane into the sugar mills. People would sometimes lose fingers and hands, arms.
So have the people here been compensated for such actions by the Danish?
No, there's not been any reparations. There was talks. In fact, we were involved in a project in 1970 was the transfer. The 100th centennial was in 2017. In 2016, we were in talks with a foundation. It was called the Foundation for Historic Houses in Denmark, and they were willing to match funds, up to $20 million, to restore, to build a museum and to build like a school. And that was going to be kind of like a reparations project. Problem is,
that's like a charitable contribution project, not really reparations.
No, but they were talking about it as a way as we made all of this money, we built our empire off of enslaved labor and the sugar. Used to be this. And if you look at Copenhagen, all the mansions, all the wealth, like all those warehouses, it's all built off of all the sugar money off of all enslaved African slavery.
So like I said, $20 million is not enough.
$20 million is peanuts. The problem is they didn't even do it. Because they ended up getting a new person in charge who was even before like Trump, that was, you know, very fascist, very xenophobic, very anti-immigrant. And they basically squashed the whole thing. So we are still working with the foundation, and they did say that they're still willing to help us. But we didn't have the backing that we did have of like the actual parliament.
So there's no formal governmental talks between the islands.
They haven't even apologized. They haven't officially apologized. That was supposed to happen too. That hasn't even happened.
Well, I mean, I feel like the people maybe take a little bit of resources back over the apology.
Yeah.
But apology is a first step.
It is a first step. The problem is they try to pass the buck to the U.S. They're like, oh, but you're still a colony now under the U.S. Why aren't you fighting the U.S.? And they're like, the U.S. needs to step it up too.
Well, you gotta follow the money though.
That's
first
what
of all.
I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, the U.S. can.
No,
I mean,
it was
where
the
did
Danes.
the U.S. get involved?
It was the Danes from 1733 to 1917, and I mean, great fortunes were amassed. I mean, look at Denmark, one of the wealthiest, happiest nations in the world. I mean, I think what would be really powerful if they weren't going to do a monetary thing, come over and fix our power, like with all of their solar, and they do a lot of wind.
But that can be part of a reparations package.
Part of
it doesn't necessarily be cash payments, but you still need the cash. You still need the cash because, I mean, that's what you have. And your ancestors passed that down to you.
In fact, it's crazy because like Haiti, you know, it's just crazy because, it's nuts. They got reparations. The planters that were enslaving folks and making their riches got reparations.
Yeah, French got reparations.
No one here too.
Even in the U.S., some of the slavers in the South got stuff too.
They did here after emancipation.
I don't know what it is. It's like Europeans always get stuff whether they win or lose. I don't know what's going on in Europe.
So
when they lose, they still win.
Yeah, so these are all good questions, and that, I think you'll love the exhibit that we redid. We did it for the 175th, which was last summer. And
would you be able to take pictures? Well, I got my GoPro here, but maybe. Yeah, no, that's fine. You gotta.
Yeah, I gotta man the fort.
You gotta man the fort. You gotta make sure nobody tries to.
But I can definitely, when Isaac comes back, I can take photos to help you.
Oh, okay, Or is there somebody else working who could?
Yeah, there is, but he's back from his lunch. But
that's fine.
Be back soon.
Okay, one last question before I venture out because I feel like the rain's letting up. So when did the U.S. get involved, and why is Denmark blaming the U.S. on anything?
So the U.S. bought us in 1970 as a strategic naval base.
Okay.
Interesting to know the liminal status. We were not actually. You have to understand. You know, the descendants of Africans, so, you know, Afro-Danes or Afro-Crucians or really Black Virgin Islanders were not, they were sold with the land. So they were really not given a say when the transfer happened. And we were actually under U.S. naval rule to 1936. And there was huge migrations with the Harlem Renaissance, but even before that, you know, like right around the transfer. There was a ton of people that moved to Harlem and really greatly influenced a lot of the intellectualism, a lot of the Black liberatory thinking, philosophy, radicalism.
Like the Harlem Renaissance.
Big time. Hubert Harrison, most notably, and Edward Blyden were he was the father of Pan-Africanism. So really important to think about all of the Black brilliance that kind of came from here. And I'm really rooting that in this history of resistance. And that, you know, Virgin Islanders, Afro-Danes fought back at all times and all moments and really stood up for human rights. So I really am hoping that we're able to, with our cultural tourism, we just were made a National Historic Monument or a historic site. Congress granted that with our fabulous Congresswoman, Stacey Plaskett, and our former Congresswoman, Donna Christensen, who laid the foundation, and then Stacey made it happen. We really need to really, you know, honor the St. Croix is the first stop on the Underground Railroad. This is where, you know, revolution that ended slavery was first here on American soil. And really, I think it could be a really empowering place for Black Americans, African Americans to come and really get this history, get the Maroon history, get this history of revolution and resistance, get the history of Black consciousness and how we inspired, you know, a lot of the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people don't know about
They don't know.
the Virgin Islands and how it
write about
relates
it
to the
and do it
U.S.
in these
history
little art shows
and stuff like that.
I'm trying to get it. It's going to be in our permanent exhibits when we redo it. But that authentic story told from the Virgin Islands of this really empowering history hasn't fully been told. You know, a lot of it was really the colonial take, and it was racist. Let's admit. You know, a lot of these old Danish guys writing the archives back then didn't care about Black culture in the way of really showing. And if it's not in the archives and they say it didn't exist, but we did have fabulous culture. If you think about Quelbe, is one of these cultural legacies, or scratch music, which are really this inventive, kind of like steel pans, instruments that are made out of like from nothing. I mean, we're talking old sardine cans and, you know, old, really just car parts. And you're making scratch band with some of the instruments, banjo, like instruments that are, you know, an African, you know, basically guitar. Right. One of those was built. One of the first guitars built was on a plantation here. It's in Denmark. Oh, wow. They have all of our tangible, they have all of our heritage.
It's the UK with Egypt. Oh, they just took a lot of stuff.
At the time of the transfer, they took
or even
a lot
France,
of it.
I guess.
And it hasn't even been shown. It's like literally in the basement at the National Museum there. It's like at least let our people be able to see what was built here so that they understand the brilliance that was invented. Because we know, yes, some of this is African retention and brought, and it's embodied with the spiritual and the political, you know, elements of art that are African. But then it's reinvented when you have to code switch and you have to improvise with whatever they find here. So things that are locally sourced, or you're taking a colonial thing like bambula and you're using your colonial dress, but then you're really organizing to be able to, you know, communicate freely without the oppressors knowing. So this is all brilliance that wasn't fully captured in the archive that now our local researchers and historians and artists are really taking back the narrative. We're really beginning to retell the story from an authentic Virgin Islands place.
Sounds great. And, but how are they tying the U.S.? Like, why are the Danish saying that, you know, the U.S. should pay reparations?
Just saying,
just because they purchased everything?
They're just saying, like, they're kind of passing the buck in a way.
They're trying to like,
well, but you guys are still,
you own it now.
Yeah, but you're
so
still being colonized by them.
Like, you
Why
own
don't
it
you
now.
go after them?
Yeah,
it's more of like a passing the buck of blame. And not really wanting to own up and take the responsibility.
That's like with
pay the price.
Reparations debate. That's essentially saying, oh, the United States, oh, it's not really us, it's the UK, you know? Even though once the United States became sovereign from the UK, they were still doing all those practices. So.
But justice, the truth always comes out. I believe in that. I really do. And I know that the more we have people of African and Caribbean descent in these roles as researchers and historians, as archivists, as archaeologists, they're telling the full story, they're excavating it, they're telling the truth.
revealing all those marginalized histories that were concealed. They existed, they were hidden.
Yeah, I think the awareness to the legislatures and the pressure to them is really what needs impacted. Hey, Graham.
Welcome back to